Okay, hi, this is Susan Leshen, and I am a licensed social worker and the Senior Director of Patient Program and Volunteer Services at the Marfan Foundation. And I'd like to introduce Jan Lynch, who's sitting right next to me.
Hi.
And she is the Director of our Help and Resource Center. And we're very happy to welcome you to the Marfan Syndrome Related Conditions Empowerment Series in this webinar. We are addressing topics that our community has told us they want to hear more about to improve the quality of their lives. We are very grateful to the Chu and Chan Foundation for their support, which makes this empowerment series possible. Sorry, sometimes when I have to, no, I can do it that way. Stop. Okay, sorry, just a technical, trying to move a slide issue. There it goes, I got it. Okay, now you can see what we look like. So tonight I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on grief and grieving. The webinar will be recorded and accessible via our website. We will send you a link in the next few days, and we would also like your feedback on this and ask you to complete the survey that will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Tonight we have about an hour to spend together, and after the presentation there will be plenty of time for questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen, not the chat box. We will answer as many of them as we can today. If I don't get to all of them, please know that we will follow up with you in the coming days. Sorry. So what is grief? What many people do not realize is that grief is not always about death. Grief is actually about loss, and loss can come to us in many forms. Regardless of the type of loss, the grief is very real, and it brings with it a profusion of feelings which may be very confusing or difficult to manage. Always remember, it is a totally different experience for each person that is going through the grief process, and there are no rights and no wrongs in how we cope. Grief is also a process that helps us to heal, so it is very important that we allow ourselves to go through the process. Grief is natural and necessary. Our culture tends to deny, diminish, or judge the pain of grief. But the truth is that grief is not something to be afraid of. It's not something we should ever hide from, and we should not think of ourselves as being bad or weak because we are grieving. Grief is not an illness or a mental health problem.
That's right, Susan. I think there are some beautiful points there. And I think it's also important that we all think about the fact that you cannot do anything wrong in this process. It is the nature of grief that it is always shifting, nor is it linear, and there's no outward standard. So each, as you have said, is very unique for each person.
In addition to experiencing grief when someone passes, we also may experience grief when a friend cancels a plan that we've been looking forward to, if we lose a job, sometimes if we're injured, sick, sometimes when we get a life-changing diagnosis, which many of you have gone through, either for yourself or for your family members. This can be a time of grieving. Many people grieve when the seasons change, or they move, or they get a divorce. All of these are times that our emotions will be very heightened, and we will have the need to grieve.
That's right, and with all of these losses, and these are many different losses that we've listed here, there are different experiences of grieving. And there's different emotions, reactions, and feelings. For example, feelings of loneliness, fear, numbness, guilt, regret, despair. And that comes along, all of those different feelings come along in the grieving process.
Dr. Alan WOLFELT, who is from the Center for Life and Loss, has a beautiful quote, which is, "Grief waits on welcome, not time." And to me, this means that it doesn't matter when you grieve, just that you do grieve, and that you need to open yourself up to grieving. But there is no right time and there is no wrong time to grieve. There is no limit to the time that you grieve, and there's no limit to the time that you begin to grieve. So one kind of grief we also have is grief caused by anticipation. This is a loss that is more predictable than other losses. We are the only species aware of the inevitability of our own death. This can create tremendous amounts of anxiety for us through each stage of our life. It takes us out of the safe world and puts us into an unsafe world where death and loss becomes a reality. This is a loss we both plan for us, for the person who's passing, and for those who's staying behind. We can also anticipate life changes, which may cause us to feel grief for the person we had hoped to become. As humans, we are very aware of having a future, but we fear tremendously that the future we want may not come to fruition. We may anticipate obstacles that will block our path, and sometimes the fear is our biggest obstacle. Sometimes our fear makes it very hard to move forward. Anticipatory grief is not the real experience of grief. The real experience of grief starts the first second that this anticipated event actually occurs. That's the moment when our life will forever be changed. Another form of grief is grief caused by innocence, and this is a loss of our past. This grief can result from some events in your life after which you are no longer the person you were before. Abuse, whether physical, emotional, or sexually, can be this type of grief. Sometimes we lose trust in ourselves, in our abilities to protect ourselves, and we also can lose trust in other people's ability to save us. Loss of innocence can occur at any age. It is especially true for children who may be forced to grow up faster due to circumstances beyond their control. Grief can also be caused by the loss of a dream, and this is a loss of the future. Loss of a dream may occur from many, many different life events, and these life events have changed the course of your life. And often we are so caught up in managing the event that we forget that the loss has occurred, and we forget to grieve. Such as when we get a new diagnosis, or we find out something else is wrong with us physically, we get so caught up in finding the right doctor, the right hospital, preparing ourselves for what is to come, that we forget that we have to grieve the loss of our health. We have to grieve the loss of what we felt about ourselves as a healthy person.
That's right, Susan. When we just think about in our own lives, ways that our lives have changed differently than we thought it was going to happen. The loss of the dream of where we thought who we were. And there's that discomfort. And needless to say, that discomfort can have a lot of different feelings associated with it. But, I've been thinking a lot about this, and sometimes we can find in that discomfort, in that change of who we actually are, we actually can discover new strengths and new attributes about ourselves.
Sometimes when we have a loss of a dream, we have to rewrite our story. And that can be difficult because we kind of love our story, or we're kind of very attached to our story. And so we might hesitate to try and rewrite it. But it's important to begin rewriting the new story of your future, which will help you to move on. We also have grief caused by the loss of stability, and this is a loss that occurs in the present. These losses occur in the here and now, and they may affect how you feel about yourself and your sense of identity. They may cause you to feel unstable, not certain of who you are, or how you feel. Some examples of these may be losing a job, or if a close friend moves away, a divorce, or a natural disaster that destroys your home, and many of us have experienced many of that across the country these days. It can also be the feelings we have when the seasons change, when a holiday season is over, when an event that we've been looking forward to is canceled, or we are too ill to attend a special event. Even finishing an all-consuming project or book can leave us with feelings of loss and not knowing how to move forward. The important thing to do in these situations really is, first of all, acknowledge that this is a loss. These changes in our life affect us. They're not something to just brush away and say, oh, it's silly. We need to grieve this loss. Do not try and be brave and pretend the loss didn't affect you, because it did. And as you grieve this loss, you may need to rethink your self-perception. As in the loss of a dream, you will need to create another story for yourself. But this time the story takes place in the present. And now we move on to grief caused by an actual death. And this is what we call the loss of the self. This is the most acceptable cause of grief by society. And we, as human beings, will lose many people in our lives. We will lose many pets. We will lose many, I ran out of pets and people in our lives. They will each have held a special place, and their loss will have left a space that no one else can fill. And don't try to fill it with somebody else. This hole in our lives is recognized as a substantial loss. We may feel a loss of self or a secondary loss, which occurs because the person is gone, and we may need to redefine who we are now without having that person in our lives. So a beautiful quote by Maya Angelou, which really touched me at this point, was, "We delight in the beauty of the butterfly, but rarely admit the changes it has gone through to achieve that beauty." And try and apply some of that to your own lives when you think about the changes that you have to go through and who you might be on the other side of that change.
So when we talk about stages of grief and grieving, one of the people that comes to mind for many of us is Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She has identified years ago the 5 stages of grief. She didn't mean them to be in an orderly fashion. She rather was very clear that we can go through different stages and back. We can go to depression and back to denial, to acceptance and back to anger. And that's an important part of this to understand. And so in these stages of grief, in these 5 stages of grief, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many different feelings and reactions that you can have. So if you are in the stage of denial where you are not wanting to, are not admitting that you've had this loss, and specifically for me, what comes up is the grief and grieving for someone you've lost in death. There is, for example, a great numbness that can occur. It's a reaction to the fear of actually feeling again. Also, time in grieving, time loses all measure. The world has stopped, while others seem to quite, and put in quotes, rudely go about their day. And it really does feel like that, doesn't it? When you're in the grief and grieving process, and particularly denial, you're wondering, how can they just go about their day when I've lost my loved one? And particularly talking about in death and dying. And then if you look in the stage of anger, there are lots of different feelings that go on during that time. Fear and confusion and mood swings and grief attacks. Dr. Kubler-Ross says this: "We are not accustomed to the emotional upheaval that accompanies a loss. We can go from feeling okay to feeling devastated in a minute without warning. We can have mood swings that are hard for anyone around us to comprehend because even we don't understand them." And I think that's beautiful. And regret, of course, is part of this anger. We try not to regret things in the past because we cannot change them, yet the regret comes anyway. With bargaining, There, of course, is the whole process of feeling guilty. We feel guilty because we hadn't been able to protect our loved one and keep them from dying. And in this whole grieving process by Dr. Kubler-Ross, I am talking more specifically about the death and dying process. We feel guilty because we are having a good day and smiling and laughing, and that seems disloyal. And I think we can all relate to that. We feel guilty because we feel guilty. And then, of course, in the whole process of being depressed, there's despair, which is one of grief's most potent weapons. There's loneliness, and I just am so struck by this, that yes, there's grief, and then there's the loneliness of grief. It's one of the most painful parts. And no one understands how I feel. And that's, people think they know you, and they say yes, they pretend that they say, oh, you're doing so great, but they don't know you. And that makes everybody feel better when they say, oh boy, you're really doing great. Everyone feels better but you. And I'm hurrying these stages along, but they are not to be hurried, and they're not in the sequence. The last is acceptance, and some of, again, this listing here is not complete, but finding community and sharing with other grievers helps in the acceptance process. There's also hooray for me, meaning that it makes you feel vulnerable, but at the time of acceptance, you start to notice that you are feeling better, and you can applaud yourself for that. I must mention, we're going to mention at the very end, but this book, Grief, Day by Day, by Jan Warner, is spectacular. And she talks about these feelings that I've just described and issues, but many, many, many more. And I did an outline of some of them that we'll share with you. It gives you a much fuller understanding of some of the feelings and reactions you can have grief day by day. Clara Hinton has a readership at silentgrief.com that grew to the thousands. And then she started a Facebook support group. And that was all in her effort to help people in the acceptance process.
Sorry, one of those technical difficulties. Okay. William Worden, another person who had worked tremendously on grief, discussed a task-centered approach to coping with grief. He feels that grieving is not just a matter of time passing, but there actually needs sometimes to be work to be done. Sometimes it needs to be something you dedicate yourself to. Again, none of these processes are linear. Some of these steps may repeat themselves. There is no specific order that these things will go in. So he talks about accepting the reality of the loss. It's very similar to Kubler-Ross's concept of denial. It's very hard sometimes to realize, and this can apply again to anything. And we'll say, if we'll use it for maybe losing a job, did I really lose that job? Did it really happen? Why did it happen? And you play over and over in your head how that loss happened. And part of that then can also be feeling and working through the pain. Any kind of loss can make us feel very vulnerable and can make us feel like we are not in control of our world. And that's kind of okay, because we're not in control of our world, and loss will happen. But working through the pain of feeling vulnerable, allowing ourselves to feel vulnerable, is very important in this process. To not be stoic and not feel like we can do everything is very important to the process. Adjusting to the new environment. And by new environment, it's not just the physical environment, it's also the emotional environment. Who am I now? What does my social environment look like? What is my emotional environment? Who do I turn to if I lost somebody? What do I do with my day if I've lost a job? How do I feel about who I am without that person in my life or without that job in my life. And then another step that he talks about is called reinventing yourself and learning to live again. So sometimes after a loss, at some point, we start to think about, how are we going to rewrite that story that I was talking about before? What is that story going to look like? Who am I now after this loss? And who do I want to be? Think about who you want to be, because that's part of the learning to live again. Moving on into being the new person, the new you after this loss is very important.
Yes, Susan, that's beautiful. And in all of these processes, it's I think that we need to note that it's important to give ourselves the gentle care we give to others or to our pets. Are there small changes that we can make in our day that will increase and improve our health and well-being? Are there large changes we can make? And so when we think about going through the grieving process, as you can see just with William Worden, it's work. And so how can we help ourselves and take better care, help ourselves feel a little better? And
part of that is also thinking about self-care, because how often when somebody is grieving, they do let their self-care slide. And I'm not talking about getting your hair done or anything, which, by the way, is very important, because you should feel good about your appearance and not be ashamed to feel good about it. But also self-care in the terms in letting yourself have space. Letting yourself, you don't want to be with people? Don't be with people. You want to sit down and watch television all day? Do that. You want to take hot baths? Do that. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, whatever works for you is what you need to do. So Dr. Alan WOLFELT, who we spoke about before, talks about the 6 needs of mourning. And he feels that during our journey through grief and mourning, we all encounter 6 needs that we must meet in order to heal. These are, again, very similar, but kind of stated differently. So again, acknowledging the reality of the death or the loss. It happened. It did happen. Sometimes we need to write that down, okay? Sometimes we try to forget it, that it happened. Again, embracing the pain of the loss, allowing ourselves to feel the pain, allowing ourselves to know that it's okay to feel pain. Sometimes people are afraid to feel pain because they're afraid that it will never stop. What if I allow myself to feel this pain and I never stop feeling the pain? And that doesn't actually happen. It won't happen. But you continue to feel pain when you don't allow yourself to really experience and embrace it. When you skid around the pain of the loss, that's when the pain doesn't go away. That's when you don't allow yourself to really feel it, to feel it fully inside of you. Remember the person who died. Remember the loss of that person or that job. One of the things I tell people a lot of times is write a letter to the person who died. Sometimes we have a lot of things left unsaid when something happens. So it's not a bad thing to write letters, to start a diary. Now, this is not something you're going to be doing forever. This is just a final goodbye letter. And then we move on and we start to develop a new self-identity. Again, who am I without this person in my life? Who am I now? Who do I want to be? How do I want to be to honor that person, maybe? Many people will search for meaning. Why did this happen? And for a lot of people, meaning will come to them through their religion. And for others, they'll find it through their humanity or their connection with family and friends. But find whatever the reason is for you. Something that means something to you about why you are suffering this loss. Very important is to let yourself receive support from others. Jan had mentioned before that sometimes people don't know how to offer support. We're going to talk about that on our next slide. But even if they offer it in the wrong way, accept it. Maybe help them to understand how they can help you. We're not born knowing how to help people grieve. You know, we are so fearful of grief in our own lives that it's even harder for us to help somebody have it in their lives. So if somebody is not helping you in the way you need it, let them know gently, with love, that this is what you need. And you appreciate everything they're doing for you, but this is what you need. So one of the areas that we wanted to also cover was, how do you help others cope? How do you help people in your life who have had losses of any kind, death, jobs, divorce, whatever the loss is, how do you help them cope? And the important thing, of course, to remember is that everybody will experience loss at some time in their life. We always want to help the person who had this loss, but we don't know how. And so the most important thing you do is you focus on the life of the person coping with the loss. You don't focus on the loss. You focus on the person, because they are the thing that is important at that point. You focus on what is their needs. And you don't have to say to them, I understand how you feel, because you don't understand how they feel. Even if you have had the identical same loss, the way that you felt during your time and the way that they feel is very, very different. So sometimes what I find is better to say is that I can appreciate that you're suffering right now, or I can appreciate that you have had a loss. Please tell me how I can help you. And that's really the most special thing you can say to somebody. Tell me how I can help you. And then that will open the door for them. And they hopefully will tell you what you can do for them. And it may not be what you wanted done for you in your loss, but it may be what they need. We also, I kind of thought of this in a kind of funny way, but for anybody who's on Facebook, we do live in a world with a one-click condolences. You know, we have on Facebook a sad button with a little tear coming down. And when we hear about sad news from somebody, we click that, and then we often feel that we've done all we can do. But sometimes we haven't. And sometimes if there's other ways that we can reach out to that person besides just clicking the sad face. Remember, you do have to do what's comfortable for you, and you have to do what's comfortable for them.
And I think, Susan, they're beautiful points. And I think that when we think about helping others to cope, that helps us to understand what we need when we're trying to cope with a loss, whatever it might be. All of these same principles apply. So what is good for others is good for ourselves.
So another quote that I love from the grief recovery method was, grief is an emotional experience, and no matter how hard society tries to act as if sad feelings don't exist, they do. And I really was struck by this because it really talks about how so many times people are afraid to show that they're sad, or people try to deny people's sadness because they don't know what to do with it. And it is totally okay to be sad. And it is totally okay to let somebody be sad when they're with you. So I wanted to just have a slide about some of the books and articles. Again, this will be part of the webinar that will be on the website. I can also include these in our email that will be sent out to you, which will have the survey on it. So if anybody has any questions about any of these sources, please get in touch with us.
So wait, let me just add here. So that third one, the Grief Day by Day by Jan Warner, there is an additional outline that I'm providing. I picked through and discussed a number of the different parts of her book. She has a, she has a day by day, literally each day is a different feeling. And then she has exercises that you can do to help you with that feeling, whether it's despair, depression, regret, hope. She does, you know, it's both ends of the spectrum. She also talks about, Jan talks about all of the many different resources that are available to all of us, whether it be on the internet. I mean, we have so much more. It was one of our participants, Barbara Miller, we were talking about with her before the actual webinar began, how it's so different now, all that we have at our fingertips to help us. And it doesn't have to be going to a support group an hour away. There are many things, and Jan Warner talks about that. You can sit in the comfort of your living room and feel supported in a support group online. But anyway, she talks about all of the different possibilities to receive help. And I mentioned that silentgrief.com. You can go there. And then she's also started, there's a number of Facebook pages too for those that are experiencing grief.
And all of this information will be included in the email that we send out afterwards. So I want to thank you. And if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A button and please type in your questions. Don't use the chat room for this. Just use the Q&A button. And right now I don't see a question, but we're going to wait.
Yeah, I'd love to add to anybody that's here with us, I'd love you to make a comment. We'll read it to everybody. Like, I know all of you, it's a shame that we can't all chat together because that would be beautiful. But if there's any comment that you want to share with each other, we can read them. It doesn't have to be a question. I think this kind of discussion is more for sharing of experiences.
Or if, and you know, so anything you want to tell us about your own personal journeys would be great to add. And we will leave your name out of it. So we will not identify who's asking a question or who's telling about their journey. While you're also busy typing, I'm sure, I just wanted to just say, you know, in 2019, we're going to have many more empowerment webinars. We're going to do these once every other month on relationships, family planning, bullying, so many more topics. The dates and registration information will be available on our website, and we will also let you know by email in our e-newsletter and on our social media. If anybody has any suggestions for topics for webinars, please send them to me, Susan Leshen. My email is, I'll also have it in the letter, in the email we send out to you, but my email is sleshen@marfan.org. And if you're enjoying these webinars and benefit from our information, we hope you'll also consider supporting us. Today is Giving Tuesday, and there's a few hours left to help us reach our goal. And you can donate at marfan.org/givingtuesday. So grief, so somebody wrote in, this grief seems overwhelming when we have one more thing on the go. More than one thing on the go. So are you saying that, and I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's very hard to grieve when you also have to do so many other things in your life at the same time. You know, how do you put aside time for yourself and for grief when you have to take care of your children, take care of your parents, take care of your home, take care of the holiday, whatever it is that's coming up, it can be overwhelming. And that's a great point. And one of the things that I want to speak to about that is try to not have to do so many, more than one, correct, more so that there's more than one thing to grieve. More that there's more than one thing to grieve. Yeah. Very good point. Yeah. Sometimes we have multiple things to grieve at the same time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we might have more losses. We might have, we may have lost our job and recently lost a loved one. Mm-hmm. We may have found out we have a chronic diagnosis and also have to dealing with what our future is going to be like, and maybe we can't hold on to our jobs. That could be difficult, and we have to actually call that multiple grief. And it's not impossible, and you will go through all of the same stages if you allow yourself. But the important thing here in terms of multiple grief is that each one of them is a separate grieving experience. Don't try to mush them all together. Allow yourself to grieve for each thing separately. Don't feel like, oh, I lost my job and I just got a chronic diagnosis and it's all one big thing. No, each thing means something separate to you. So please take the time and grieve for each thing. It can be overwhelming if you try to grieve for everything at the same time. Please take the time to give yourself individual grief for each episode in your life. If my answer is not helpful enough, I want to also emphasize here, for anything that we don't answer, anything you want to talk to, please feel free to call myself or Jan any day. We are always here Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and would love to speak to you. Somebody else just wrote, thanks for the session. I'm glad you're covering these sorts of topics. Nobody has to suffer alone.
That's the truth. Oh, boy.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this day and age, you know, I just have to pipe in because I was reading this. That is the honest to gosh truth. And again, we were talking earlier before the webinar even began. In 2018, we have so much more available to us. Like, we can look back 30 years ago and say, wow, we didn't have all of these possibilities for support and help. But right, go ahead, keep reading. It's
yeah,
beautiful.
and then she said it's very normal to be suffering these systems throughout life and death. We have pain. We have a host of worries for our children and our extended family.
Yeah, beautiful.
And that's absolutely so true. Thank you for sharing that. Because pain can be something you have to grieve. Because what is pain but a loss of freedom sometimes, or a loss of the ability to move, or sometimes the loss of being able to do something like hiking or biking or something that you love to do. You worry about your children and you know what their future is going to be like. But a lot of what you're also talking about is what we call anticipatory grief that we spoke about. We have to be careful that we don't get too wrapped up in anticipatory grief, that we try to live our day by day, our life rather, day by day, and deal with the grief when it comes more than expecting it to come.
I know I sound like I'm Jan Warner's publicist. I'm really not. But she, in this grief day by day, each day has a different focus. And in those quotes, there are people, famous people, people that aren't famous, but she gives some hope to the process too, in like regret. And she'll talk about regret in both in how it's difficult, but also how to help you with that regret. It's just beautiful. I was very, very inspired by it. But I guess I was playing off Susan and the person that had written in with the one we just read about how these are all things we have to deal with, you know, all of these feelings that we're having and experiences.
Somebody had written that they're experiencing a second loss because they had lost their son, and now their daughter-in-law is refusing them access to their grandchildren. And I am so sorry for that, because you're grieving for the loss of your grandchildren. I would love to talk to you individually about that. There are things you can do. If you would like to call me at any point, it's very hard to do this. I don't know why she's doing this. I don't understand, you know, the full picture. So obviously it's a little hard to answer the question. But if you would like to call me privately, I would love to talk to you more about this.
And she says at the end, I see a grief counselor, and she has been very helpful to me. That's good for everybody to know that that has been helpful to you, Barbara.
Yeah. So somebody else had just asked, what are the different types of grief counseling available? And that's a great question. I mean, I'm a social worker and I do a lot of grief counseling. So one of the biggest ones and easiest ones is, of course, going to see a therapist, whether it's a social worker or a psychologist. I personally, push social worker, but either one. And you can also go to individual grief counseling. And I also very much stress group grief counseling. There are many groups that exist that you can look up on the internet. And then there are many groups that are just out in the community that you can find. I know a lot of women who went to grief counseling for loss of their spouse, and now they're all very good friends, a lot of them, and they have developed an entire friend network out of this. So after the grief counseling, they continue to support each other through these friendships.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to note, with my background in nursing, I've been involved in support groups, and you've got to find, and it's a little bit of an effort, but not as much now with the whole, you know, being able to explore on the internet. The one that works for you. Like I have people calling in every day here, and some say, oh, I need an in-person. Give me an in-person. Oh, no, I'm not going. I don't have the time. I'm not located. So what works for you? And some people like one-on-one, you know. Some people choose like a friend. I think when you talk about the different types of grief counseling, the one thing I really feel is important to figure out which one works best for you, what way can help you.
And don't be afraid to try different ones. If you go to something and it doesn't work for you, it doesn't feel right to you, first of all, don't be afraid to leave that, okay? You're not married to this. And second of all, don't give up and try something else, because every therapist and every form of grief counseling doesn't work for every person. So part of our self-care is making sure that we get the grief counseling that works for us. Another question we just had is somebody said, the who I am now resonates, the pre-Marfan diagnosis to after operation and limited health. Yeah, I kind of wanted to do, one of the reasons I wanted to do this grief program, not just on death, is because I really feel, after talking to so many people who have gotten diagnoses, that is a grieving process, and that is something you need to go through. The who I am now after the diagnosis. What am I meant to do? How do I conduct myself socially when I am such a different person, she writes. So first of all, look at how you're different and how you're not different. Okay, so you feel different. You have a diagnosis. You've had a serious operation, and now you have limited health. But in what ways are you not different? Have you still a lot of the same friends? Do they still like you for things that have nothing to do with your diagnosis? Do you still enjoy doing things that have nothing to do with your diagnosis? For example, if you loved to read and want to join a book club, that your diagnosis will not affect that. If you want to go to the movies or go out to eat more often, your diagnosis won't affect it as often as you think it might. So before you think of yourself as such a different person, find the reasons that you are not different. And then look at the things that are different. And that's where we talk about what I said before about changing your script, changing your story. What is your new story that you're going to write for yourself? Who do you want to be? You are not limited by your diagnosis. You're limited by yourself, limiting yourself. It's kind of too many limitings in there. But if you limit yourself and say, I can't do more because of my diagnosis, then that's how it's going to be. But if you tell yourself that I can do a lot with my diagnosis, then that's how it's going to be. Somebody said, I appreciate the session. Thank you. The openness of allowing the grief process to be what it is for each person, so important. I like that you don't immediately label it medically as depression. Really good point. How do you tell the difference between grief and depression? Thank you for bringing that up. Really, really good point. So there's two different diagnoses that you can talk about. One is grief and one is melancholy. And that's how you tell the difference between grief and depression. Grief is a moving process. You move from different stages. Like you said, the stages can repeat each other. They can be one thing one day you feel denial, one day you feel angry, one day you feel guilt, different things. Melancholy, which is what we call depression when it comes from grief, is the same. You don't move, you're not moving. You're stuck in one stage. And you're dwelling on that stage. So if you're stuck in the stage of denial, you spend your whole time just denying that this happened, denying that, how could this happen? Why did it happen? If you're stuck in anger, then you spend all your time just being very angry at the world for allowing this to happen, angry at God, angry at doctors. Okay, if you're stuck there, and by stuck I mean 6 months. Okay, the diagnosis for stuck into melancholy is 6 months in any one particular stage. And do not be afraid of medication. You know, it doesn't mean you have to be labeled as depressed to receive antidepressant medication. Antidepressant medication is the same as taking high blood pressure medication when you have high blood pressure. Talk to your doctor about it and see if some kind of a little bit of medication maybe might help you. It's not something you have to do. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying be open to other ideas. But I see, like ruminating. Yes, melancholy is very much like ruminating. Thank you. Yes. Ruminating is, again, you're stuck in one stage. You're not moving around. And the time period, like I said, is about 6 months that you're stuck in that stage. You just keep going on and on and on, over and over again in that same place. You're not moving forward and you're not moving backward. Even moving backward is a positive step in this process because you're moving.
Yes. There's no such thing as really moving backwards. You're moving around in those different stages. And that's actually beautiful because it means you're really doing the work of grief and grieving. I really also like when someone said the "who am I now" resonates. And I think that that's something when we have losses and grief and grieving, they affect us in big ways, whatever that loss might be. And that examination of who I am now and where do I want to head is in that process of grief and grieving too. Oh, it's so heavy duty, isn't it? It's like someone said previously, how do you make time for this when you have all of these different losses going on? It's certainly a lot. And Susan has already said it. I'd like to reiterate it. You're welcome to email us. I think our contact information is up there. Did you?
Yeah, I'm putting our contact information up now.
Good, thank you.
So even while we're doing the questions and answers.
Oh yeah, we're not finished, but.
Right, please, you can jot down any of the information on here. You can contact us by phone, by email, and you can also go through the website through Ask a Question. So any way that works for you, please, reach out.
As you can see, Susan and I are, we chat and with people every single day from our community, and we love to try to help. And sometimes two heads are better than one. You're not alone in this process.
Somebody had just put some hash marks on the thing. We weren't quite sure how to answer that.
Yeah, we weren't sure what it was.
And she said, "Sorry, that's the dog." Yeah, my dog likes to do that. My dog also likes to lay his head on my keyboard when I'm working because he feels I'm not paying enough attention to him.
You know what? I just thought of I meant to mention this earlier. Susan and I run support groups. Somebody was asking about the grief support groups. I run a 50+ support group that's fabulous. They are somebody's laughing.
Yeah,
I love this. We can interact in a different way. But anyway, if you're interested in the 50+ support group, please contact me at that email address that's listed.
Right.
I'm also trying to reignite a newly diagnosed group, and that's my goal for the new year, that I will do that. So those are my two, and I know Susan has.
I run two groups. One is I call it Gen X. It's for people for support for people who are between 30 and 50, and then I also run a pain support group, and we will send the dates and times of those meetings in our email. Again, yes, we will include that. It's going to be a very long email right now. We will include that also in the email. We have
just
a few
for me, anybody that's interested in the 50+ or newly diagnosed, just reach out to me at jlynch@Marfan.
Yeah. We have 2 or 3 more minutes if anybody has anything else they'd like to add. I'm glad somebody's laughing here. We didn't mention it at any point here, but humor is so important to healing. They say that when you smile, first of all, many people don't know this, but you actually lose weight when you smile because it takes much more muscles to smile than to frown, and that therefore you are actually losing weight. But also, when you smile, you create hormones in your body, and when you laugh, you create even more of those hormones. We call them the happy hormones, and they help. They really do help. And there's nothing wrong ever with laughing or smiling or being happy, even though you have experienced some loss. You know, joy and loss are very connected, and you need to experience them both, and sometimes at the same time. Sometimes we can have joy for what we experienced, for the person who passed, for the life, and sometimes we can share that and mix it with our grief.
Any other comments or questions? We welcome them. And just while we're a few more minutes, we do have a number of other empowerment series webinars that have taken place. There's some on all different topics. If you haven't gotten a chance to look at them, they're on our, just put in the search bar of our website, empowerment series. In addition, Susan, I think, mentioned about the medical symposium series that we've just begun. We've had 3 of them, and they're also very enlightening. They're 2 separate series. So when you go in the search bar, put empowerment series, and then the other one is medical symposium series.
Oh, and Janet's going to join my Gen X group. Thank you. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't have used your name. Miss J is going to. We will send you more information. Okay, so I think that our time is based. Oh, wait, there's another question. Oh, thank you so much. Somebody said thank you for this wonderful presentation webinar. It was absolutely our pleasure to be here with you tonight. We love what we do, and we love the community we work for. So thank you so much for accepting us into this, your world.
And I think what you've written is beautiful, and it applies to all of us. It's such important work that we all do in that grief and grieving and feeling loss and going through that process. It is important work, isn't it? Thank you so much.
Thank you both. And I'm going to end the session now. And again, remember to contact us or either by email, by phone, and we do look forward to your emails.
Have a good night.